Welcome everyone. My name is Peyton Messersmith. I'm a project coordinator with the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, and welcome to today's webinar, Cultural Adaptations of a Suicide Prevention Trial for Indian Country with Dr. Lonnie Nelson. We want to start first with our land acknowledgement. We ask for those engaging in this event to reflect on the lands on which we reside and acknowledge all the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous peoples who have lived here since time immemorial. We would also like to take this time to acknowledge the land and pay respect to all of the Indigenous nations whose homelands were forcibly taken over and inhabited. This calls us to commit to forever learn to be better stewards of this land through action, advocacy, support, and education. We'll put in the chat a fantastic resource for native land to learn more. We also want to acknowledge that, like most modern-day U.S. institutions, the University of Washington benefits from the unaddressed legacy of stolen labor and slavery, which is at the foundation of this nation and its vast and inequitable wealth. We recognize our debt to exploited workers, past and present, whose labor was and continues to be stolen through unjust practices. And I apologize for the tone shift, but next we would like to introduce the MHTTC network. The MHTTC network is a nationwide network that is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Our network includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, a network coordinating office, and there are also networks for addiction and prevention using the same structure. The MHTTC network supports resource development and dissemination, training and technical assistance, and workforce development for the mental health field. Our Northwest MHTTC covers HHS Region 10, which includes Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. Now a bit more about our Northwest MHTTC. I know this is a busy slide, but I will walk you through it. Essentially, our goals as a center are to first accelerate the adoption and implementation of mental health-related EPPs, heighten awareness, knowledge, and skills of the workforce, foster alliances and address training needs among diverse partners, and also ensure the availability and delivery of free, publicly available training and technical assistance. Our area of focus is evidence-based practices for serious mental illnesses such as psychosis. However, we also provide training on a variety of topics, including integrated care, suicide prevention, diversity and equity issues, school mental health, peer support, trauma-informed approaches, and others. And our target workforce includes the behavioral health and primary care providers, school and social service staff, and others whose work has the potential to improve behavioral health outcomes for individuals with or at risk of developing serious mental illnesses. So how do we fulfill our mission? We provide free training and technical assistance, free self-paced online courses, live events like this one that we also record and post, as well as virtual learning communities. And we also provide monthly newsletters, our resource library, research and practice briefs, and other on-demand content on our website. To find out more about our goals, training opportunities, and resources, you can also visit our website or sign up for our newsletter. Great. And if you're in the general audience today, you are going to be noticing that you are muted and off camera. This event is recorded, and you have the option to use closed captioning if you wish. We will also share this video recording and slides and send instructions on how to obtain a certificate of attendance in a few weeks. So please use the chat for technical issues when you need our staff's help. Zoe is on call with me, and she will be helping out with any issues you might have, or to share your comments, greetings, or observations to everyone. If you have any content-related questions for Lonnie, please use the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. We will be monitoring the Q&A to facilitate answering as many as possible at the end of the presentation. And at the MHTTC network, we just want to say that one of our goals is to utilize affirming, respectful, and recovery-oriented language in all the work we are involved in. We want to remain mindful of all the different perspectives that may come up in these events. And we just kindly ask that everyone communicate using language that's respectful, non-judgmental, inclusive, and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, abilities, and experiences. And lastly, your feedback is crucial to our work, so we would just appreciate the response to a very short survey that just takes a few minutes after the session. We'll share that link by chat and also via email through Zoom tomorrow. We're required by SAMHSA to conduct this survey, so they don't have an official position on our content, but we just really appreciate your feedback about the session to plan for future ones. And most importantly, your participation helps the free training coming. All right, so I'm going to pass it on to today's presenter, Dr. Lonnie Nelson. Dr. Nelson, if you would like to introduce yourself, I'm sure you can do a better job than I can.
Thank you, Peyton. Hello, my name is Lonnie Nelson. I'm a descendant of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm an associate professor and chair of the Department of Nursing and System Science at Washington State University. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm going to be talking to you all today about the cultural adaptation phase of a suicide prevention intervention trial that we conducted from the years of 2016. The cultural adaptation happened over 2016 to 2018, and then the trial went through 2018 and just concluded data collection on August 31st. As part of the project, we proposed to include a phase one, which I often in my work conduct, which is a cultural adaptation phase. So the idea behind cultural adaptation is that you have an idea for an intervention that is evidence-based, and you want to find out if it works with a particular population in a particular type of community setting. And so you go into that community setting and you share all of your plans with people who might eventually qualify to participate in the study and treatment providers in that community. And you ask them for feedback on virtually every aspect of what you're planning to do. And you take their feedback seriously and you go off and you make the changes that they suggested. And then you come back and you say, okay, here's the new plan taking into account what you told us. And you then get their feedback on anything you might have missed or gotten wrong and implement those changes. And then you proceed with your clinical trial. So that's just a general background on what cultural adaptation generally entails. The intervention that we were adapting was called the caring contacts intervention. So these are simply caring messages that are sent to people with suicide risk over the course of a year, provides care and support, asks for nothing in return. The magic ingredient is thought to be social connection. These can be delivered by letters, phone, emails, text messages. We had originally proposed to only use text messages in this study. As you will see, that's one of the things that ended up being changed as a result of the cultural adaptation process. So here's an example of one of the original caring contacts. It's been some time since you were here at the hospital. We hope things are going well for you. If you wish to drop us a note, we would be glad to hear from you. Something that simple has been shown in various cultural settings and community settings over the years to decrease death by suicide, decrease suicide attempts, and decrease suicidal ideation. So that being the basic form of the intervention, here are some sample text messages that had been used in a previous study with a military population. David, good to meet you yesterday. Check out our website, www.care.org. Hope the resources are helpful. Kate. Hey, David, it's Kate from the CARE study. Hope you've had a good week. www.care.org. Hi there, David. Hope life is going well. So you can see these are pretty generic, pretty, simple messages. The study that was done with the military population sent out, I think it was 11 or 12 messages over the course of a year. So for this study, in the context of rising suicide rates and the high levels of death by suicide in Indian country, we need a sustainable evidence-based prevention approach. And so we proposed to conduct this trial originally in 4 Native communities. We ended up adding a 5th. And we proposed, like I said before, phase 1, cultural adaptation and tailoring to the communities served by the South Central Foundation, the Fort Peck Indian Reservation in northeastern Montana, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in southern South Dakota, the Cheyenne River Reservation in northern South Dakota, and Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. And then after having gotten feedback from all of those folks, we then proceeded with the randomized clinical trial. We ended up recruiting 711 people across all 5 sites. And I'll talk a little bit about the eligibility criteria here in a moment. So here is the basic randomized clinical trial study design. Each participant was randomly assigned for 1 year to usual care alone or usual care plus caring texts. Those who were in the usual care alone were contacted at 6 months to verify their contact information and make sure that we updated it if it was out of date. But other than that, they didn't hear from our study team after their baseline assessment until 12 months later. Those receiving the caring contacts, originally thought to be just by text message, would receive those messages over the course of the year and then would undergo the follow-up assessment at 12 months. So pretty straightforward design. The goals of phase 1 were to gather community input on the study design and make changes based on their feedback, to tailor the messages that comprised the intervention to the communities where they would be received, make sure the assessment items were clearly worded, make sure study materials were clearly worded, make the study acceptable and appropriate for American Indian Alaska Native communities, and thereby increase the likelihood of success of the trial. So the phase 1 process started off with focus groups and key informant interviews. The focus groups were held typically with people who would meet criterion for inclusion in the trial. So we were tried to recruit folks who had a history of suicidality, ideally a suicidal crisis within the previous year. And the key informants were mental health professionals and or traditional health practitioners in the communities, or community leaders. And so after doing that initial round of focus groups and key informant interviews in each one of the communities, we presented the initial feedback that we got and the revisions that we were planning to make to the community advisory board, which was composed of representatives from each of the communities that we were partnering with, and got their input for refinement and any advice that they had on how exactly we should implement various suggestions that we got from the community members. And then we went back out to the communities and invited all the folks that participated in the first round of focus groups and key informant interviews to attend a second round of those focus groups and interviews to make sure that we heard them correctly, right? So we presented the refined study revisions back to the communities for finalization and their thumbs up that we had heard them correctly. So we took all of this information that we got from the initial 4 sites. Pine Ridge and Cheyenne River are, they're pretty closely related communities. And Cheyenne River wasn't added until like the 3rd year of the clinical trial as a partner community, but they approved all of the suggestions that were made by Pine Ridge. And so we didn't actually have to carry out the phase 1 process in that community separately. So anyways, we conducted all these focus groups and interviews, and then went through a process of coding the transcripts and organizing them into themes, and then integrated that thematic analysis with these 6 domains that you see there on the side. These had primarily to do with message content, eligibility criteria for participation in the study, the assessments to the outcome measures, what the participant experience would be like, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means here in a minute, cultural approaches, and number of messages and timing. And want to give a special shout out to the South Central Foundation team that worked with us on this process. They did the lion's share of the coding and thematic analysis, and that was led by Jen Shaw, Kelly Jansen, and Jadon Avey. They really helped out to a very large extent with the coding and analysis of the qualitative data. So who we talked to were 55 focus group participants at South Central Foundation. and 5 key informants. At Fort Peck, we had 53 focus group participants and 5 key informants. At Pine Ridge, we had 28 focus group participants and 3 key informants. And at Cherokee Nation, we only had 19, unfortunately, but we did have 6 community or key informants in that community. So for a total of 155 focus group participants and 19 key informants. So the coding of the transcripts was carried out in Deduce. There were 42 total codes that were generated through the analysis of the transcripts. There were 11 general codes with 0 to 6 subcodes each. The total excerpts that were coded, 1,015. And again, these covered the domains, the major domains of message timing and number, message content, eligibility criteria, participant experience, cultural issues and adaptations, and assessment and interview items. And we'll go through each one of those here in a moment. So, with regard to eligibility criteria, the original study was proposed to have a limit of focusing on the population between the ages of 18 and 34. That did not go over well with the communities, as you might guess. The quote up there, we have a lot of elders who are dying by suicide. That's a direct quote from one of the transcripts. They suggested across all the communities that we remove the age limits altogether. When we pointed out that doing research with children is kind of dramatically different than doing research with adults, they said, okay, at least remove the upper age limit. So you include veterans and elders. Okay. They wanted a way to include rural communities and suggested that we make all study procedures so that they could be conducted over the phone. This ended up being a really prescient suggestion, given that the majority of the clinical trial took place during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so having that provision made it possible to continue recruitment and continue the study, even though there were those restrictions on personal contact. And they also said, don't make having a cell phone a criterion, use Facebook Messenger. Now, because of the privacy concerns regarding Facebook, we weren't able to necessarily include that specific mode of communication. But as you'll see here in a little bit, we did make some other modifications that allowed folks without a smartphone to participate. The cautions that came out of the themes around eligibility, most people understood the difficulty of including kids. Other folks mentioned that despite poverty, just about everybody had a phone. So that shouldn't be a dramatic limitation, but still they didn't think that having a phone should be a eligibility criterion. So this graph is the reason that we originally proposed the age cutoff of 34. So you see that big spike there. I hope you can see my cursor, but right here, that is Native American males. And this is suicide deaths per 100,000 persons. And you'll see that that peaks between the ages of 18 and 34. Now, it would also have made sense to go out to about 49, and that would include this larger sort of plateau there. But we did indeed end up extending it to not have an upper age limit. And that also allowed us to pick up this other peak back here toward the later stages of life. And so, yeah. So the eligibility changes that we made, as I said, there was no upper age limit. It was an interesting question to ask at what age texting just doesn't happen anymore. Turns out that there isn't really an upper age for that. It's pretty individually dependent. Having a phone was no longer a requirement. And based on the recommendations around eligibility, we included postal mail, email, postcards to reach people, as well as text messages. So, yeah. Regarding participant experience, it was pointed out to us that we were hearing things that not everyone gets to hear, and we needed to honor and respect that, especially during our assessment sessions. There was a strong preference among the community input for in-person screening and baseline interviews. As I mentioned before, there was also, of course, during the COVID pandemic, the telephone option. They suggested that we spend some time developing rapport before administering any study instruments, which I thought was a great common sense suggestion, obviously. They also suggested that we order the questions in the assessment packet from least to most sensitive. So start with asking things that were not terribly personal or sensitive and end up with, you know, the more specific history of suicidality and suicidal attempts and like that. And just to make sure we conduct the baseline in a comfortable private environment where people could relax. The cautions, they interpreted the control group as a no treatment control group. And in several of the communities, that was largely because there weren't any services really available. You know, in one of the communities, I won't name which one, but if a person was suicidal, they called the police and put them in jail for a 72-hour hold because that was the closest thing to an inpatient psychiatric hospitalization that was available. So we'll talk a little bit more about what the control group actually received in a few moments. Standardization of instruments and messages felt disrespectful to folks. So we had to figure out how to make sure that at least the assessments could be standardized but not feel artificial or alienating. And the standardization of the messages was done within community so that people within each community received basically the same messages, but only from the person who was working with the study in that community. And that seemed to help. And also that person wrote their own messages in collaboration with the principal investigators. We were also cautioned to be sure that the reading level wasn't too high on study materials. They suggested 5th grade level. We ended up going with 8th grade level. So in the beginning, we did have a strong preference for in-person screening and baseline. The second preference was video conferencing, and if video conferencing was not possible, phone was used if the participant wanted to do it by phone. During the COVID period, virtually all, I think it was 78% of the assessment sessions took place by phone. And I'll talk more about that as it bore out in the data later on. There were different tracks of messages appropriate to the person's relationship to the interviewer. In some of our communities, the terms of address that you would use for a person would be different if they were of the opposite sex and your same age as the person sending the message, or older than you would be a different term of address, or younger than you would be a different term of address. And so we did write different messages for those different status relationships within each community. And those were established as different tracks of messages. And this sort of spoke to that standardization of the intervention feeling artificial and disrespectful. We tried to tailor it as well we could while still keeping the intervention as uniform across sites as we were able to do. And we also had to clarify that the control group wasn't no treatment. We actually had a referral list that the study site coordinator would go over with the participant at the end of the assessment and identify which resources that were available were most appropriate for that person at that time. And I'll talk a little bit about what the frequency of referral to various kinds of services were here in a little bit. But just clarifying that the control group wasn't no treatment. Everyone who underwent the baseline assessment had this brief intervention where they were referred to resources that were available. Regarding cultural content, there was a strong sense in transcripts that knowing cultural values, humility, leadership, helping others, these things bring purpose and meaning to life, and that they wanted to be sure that the messages contained at least some cultural content that was appropriate to the community where the messages were being sent. There was a strong perception that enculturation and increasing a person's connection to their culture was a healing process and a healing gesture. And that the content of the messages should refer to local stories and metaphors. And, respecting the fact that being connected to culture is a sign of wellness, and that, traditional practices could be perceived as a rebirth of culture. On same coin, other side, not everyone is very enculturated across sites. We have a really wide range of people who live an extremely traditional life to people who scarcely even engage in any cultural practices or speak any of their language at all. So just respecting that diversity of traditionalism, and this again speaks to the need for different tracks of messaging and help to determine the degree of cultural content that was included in the messages as they were written. And it was very site specific. There was a much wider range, for instance, of enculturation, specifically at Cherokee Nation, than there was, say, at Fort Peck. It was a bit more uniform in terms of how traditional or enculturated people were at Fort Peck than Cherokee Nation. So some suggestions for things to include in the message content specifically for Cherokee Nation were stomp dance, green corn celebration, solstice, Cherokee Nation holiday. In South Dakota, suggestions were made to include references to Sundance season, medicine men, powwows, singing, moons and seasons. Up in Alaska, South Central Foundation, they suggested we include references to fishing, berry picking, hunting. AFN can be a rough time, but also time for reconnecting with one's culture, native dance, language programs. Fort Peck, they suggested that we include references to equine therapy, archery, and sweats, which apparently are very popular up there. So the site coordinators did end up drafting individual message banks in collaboration with the principal investigators to ensure appropriateness for the community. So again, we hired folks from the communities to be the assessors, and therefore the person that the messages were sent from. And that person did in fact write all of the messages for their site. And so that helped to make it more appropriate and have a better fit for the communities where the intervention was actually going out. So the existing text messages from the military study, it was 11 over the course of a year. You can see these, like the ones on the previous slide, they're generally positive. They're generally, expressing care, but not a whole lot of cultural content or references to local events or anything like that. There was the one personalized message on their birthday, and that was suggested by the communities that we keep those. Generally, people thought that those were acceptable messages, but they wanted to see some changes to the content. They wanted us to incorporate local native language terms. And this was kind of a Goldilocks domain where they wanted us to include some local native language, but not so much that it would be alienating for people who weren't really conversant in the language, but enough to demonstrate that it was coming from somebody who lived in that community, right? And so there was kind of a balancing act to carry out there. And I think we did okay. Have parallel message tracks, like I mentioned before, include some degree of spiritual content in the messages. And that also varied by site. Obviously, the different tribes have different language around spiritual concepts or entities that they preferred be used. Resend the website periodically in the messages, but not in every single message. Tie messages to the seasons was another suggestion. We ended up having a general guidelines for the message writing, such that 4 of the messages that were going to be sent over the course of the year referred to the changing of the seasons. 6 referred to encouraging them to engage in local activities that might have been going on. I think there was 1 at the holidays, 1 at the birthday. It's just off the top of my head. Anyways, we had sort of these guidelines around how many of the messages should refer to what kinds of things, as just kind of a way of trying to make the intervention uniform across the communities while still tailored to each individual community. They cautioned us to avoid being too generic or anything that might look, chatbot-like. Specifically, don't say check out our website, because that's such an overused term. Keep in mind that life can be tough, and careful of triggers, anniversaries. Again, they asked if we could use Facebook Messenger. This is a very popular method of communication amongst Native communities, but because of the privacy concerns around research participation, so Facebook will recommend that you might know someone based on who you have Facebook Messenger contact with. And if the study team was a common point of reference for multiple people, Facebook could recommend that they might know other people who were also research participants. And so for those privacy concerns, we couldn't use Facebook Messenger. So some possible adapted messages that actually ended up going out. See, the original message at 1 week would have been, John, it's Kate from the care team. Hope you had a good week. Kate, careteam.org. And then in Cherokee Nation, that would have been adapted to at 1 week. Oshio, John, it's Cassandra from last week, sending good thoughts your way. Here's a list of some things that happening that you might be interested in at careteam.org. So providing the website, but not saying, check out this website. And then at 1 month, the original message was, hi, John, hope all is well and you're taking good care of yourself. Kate, careteam.org. The South Central Foundation, Kelly Jensen said, that's LEU for hello. John, AFN is coming up. If you want to go, you can see the schedule of events here at careteam.org, Kelly. So you can see that, these are trying to conform to some of those suggestions from around the content of the messages. Report Peck, an adapted message looked like, hi, John, it's Albert Foote. Wanted you to know I'm praying for good things for you. There's a list of some things you might find helpful at careteam.org. And then at Pine Ridge, Geralda, hey, Mashke. Mashke is the term that a female would use to say kind of like, hey, brother, like someone who's the same age but the opposite sex. I just wanted to remind you that you're important and let you know I'm thinking of you, Geralda. So you can see how the suggestions from the community was sort of incorporated into the crafting of the messages that ended up comprising the intervention. Some themes around message timing. They definitely felt that 11 messages over the course of a year was not enough. They said minimum of monthly messages. They suggested that we include extra messages during suicide season or the spring. Again, suggested that we tie messages to the seasons, may need to contact controls more than just at 6 months, and don't always make it the same day of the month or week. Recognize tough times of the year, again, referencing suicide season. Don't overload people, but don't seem aloof either, was one of the cautions. And again, Facebook Messenger came up. I wish that there were a way to have a research version of Facebook Messenger that did not have those privacy concerns, that you were able to shut those off. But at the time, that was not, I don't think it still is possible. The overall suggestion regarding timings was that we consider weekly messages for the first 6 weeks, and then bi-weekly for 1 to 2 months, and then monthly after that for the rest of the year. That ended up, I think, with 24 messages or something like that over the course of the year. which is about twice the treatment intensity as was used in the previous study with the military population. They suggested that we recognize economic cycles like per cap distributions and EBT. They're typically at the beginning of the month, and people might not necessarily be feeling all that stressed out during that time because they will have just had that influx of cash, and maybe move messages more toward the end of the month when things are getting a little leaner. They suggested that we time messages to local events in terms of timing. Consider time of day too. They wanted us to vary it, so it didn't always come at 11 a.m. Different tracks should have different events referred to. So these were like college students versus people who might attend traditional cultural events. And so we tried to incorporate that as much as we really could. There weren't any additional cautions with regard to timing. So what we changed regarding message timing, we sent a message the day after the baseline, then I say about weekly because they didn't want it to be exactly 7 days, but roughly weekly for the first 6 weeks, and then bi-weekly for 1 to 2 months, and then monthly plus their birthday. The time of day was varied, but it was inside work hours locally. It did include additional messages in spring months. And it did refer to seasonal changes in messages sent at those times of the year. So we also went through each of the outcome measures that we were using to address our specific aims with the community focus groups and key informants. And we wanted to make sure that the wording and content of the outcome measures was adapted to more fully capture the experience of those in the communities we were working within. So the suicide attempt and self-injury count is a measure that was developed at the University of Washington by the co-principal investigator in the study, Kate Comtois. The original intro reads, "Now we're going to talk about self-injury or suicide attempts. For this, I want you to think about any time you have intentionally harmed yourself. This can include a number of different things, such as cutting or burning yourself, taking an overdose of pills, banging your head, or punching things." Based on the feedback that we got from phase 1, we revised that introduction to the tool to say, now we're going to talk about times that you may have tried to kill or hurt yourself. For this, I want you to think about any time you have tried to kill or hurt yourself on purpose. This can happen a lot of different ways, like cutting or burning yourself, taking an overdose of pills, crashing your car on purpose, or punching things. So the follow-up questions, you can see the slight shift in language, to ever hurt yourself on purpose as opposed to intentionally harmed yourself. They said that this felt more personable and it was a simpler, reading level, I guess. They also wanted some additional follow-up questions and changes in wording. Like they felt like asking the person, how accurate is this date that this happened? They felt like that was too officious sounding and artificial. So they preferred the wording, how sure are you about this date? And then instead of, did you intend to die? They wanted it to be an open-ended question of what did you think or hope would happen as a result of this? Were you trying to die? They wanted us to include whether they were intoxicated at the time. And then whether they received medical care, and if so, what kind. And then they wanted us to include whether they talked to anybody about it, either before or after the attempt. And then when was the most recent time you hurt yourself on purpose? And then what was the last time you hurt yourself the worst? Or what was the time that you hurt yourself the worst? So that was how we revised the original saucy questions to be responsive to things that the community members felt were important to ask about each attempt or event. So the original intro to the methods employed to hurt oneself or attempt suicide was, it's important for us to get a better understanding of different things you may have done to hurt yourself, your intentions when you hurt yourself, and when you receive medical treatment for hurting yourself. Based on the feedback we got from the communities, rather than simply stating it was important, They said that it would be better if we said that we would like to get a better understanding of different ways that you may have hurt yourself, but what you wanted to happen as a result, and when you got medical care. Just that the language sounded more straightforward and personable was the perception there. So the original list of methods included cutting, overdosing, burning, attempting to strangle or hang, jumped from a high place, shot yourself with a gun, swallowed poisons, asphyxiated, tried to drown yourself, stabbed, punctured, banged your head, hit yourself, hitting things. The community members said, okay, but we also here in this place, and it turned out not just to be Alaska only. We did clarify with the CAB and then later in round 2 of phase 1. The going into dangerous cold to freeze yourself on purpose was actually a relatively common method employed not only in Alaska, but also in northeastern Montana and in South Dakota. Not so much in Oklahoma, though it did occur occasionally. Drove recklessly on purpose was a suggested addition from Oklahoma, I think was the original suggestion, but it was also endorsed by people in other communities as well. Walked on the train track, so a train would hit you, was added at the request of people in Fort Peck, but was also endorsed by folks in South Dakota. And then walked out into the traffic, so a car would hit you, was originally introduced in Alaska, but was also endorsed by folks at all the other community sites. So I'll talk a little bit about what having those additional questions allowed us to detect that we otherwise would not have detected. There were no revisions to the measure of exposure to suicide. It just asks about how many people you know who have died by suicide or attempted and survived. There were some changes to this part of the follow-up question for the exposure to suicide questionnaire. So this is just asking, who was this person to you? And those of you who live or work in Indian country might know that whether somebody is a family or a friend or a coworker or family or an acquaintance, like those lines are blurrier in Indian country. Familial relationships in particular can be complicated by clan relationships and things like that don't make it quite as straightforward as to whether or not somebody is a family member. And so, yeah, just to note that. And then this was just the follow-up questions to what kind of an effect that event had on the person. So the effects of the study adaptations. The removal of the upper age limit. 48% of the recruited sample ended up being 35 years or older. Had we adhered to the original restrictions of 18 to 34, we would never have included these people, right? And that's ended up being half our sample. So that was certainly a significant adaptation. Using multiple modes of baseline assessment ended up being really important, especially during COVID-19. Phone was used by nearly 60% of participants overall, 79% during the pandemic. Including multiple modes of intervention delivery. While 54% of participants did elect to receive the intervention by text message, 29% requested postal mail and 17% requested email. So that ended up being a fairly significant adaptation as well. The control group intervention, nearly half, 45% of participants were referred to behavioral health treatment. This included substance use treatment. 14% were referred to financial assistance, 13% to employment services, 9% to housing assistance, and then kind of a scree plot from there where, you know, relatively individualized referrals from the resource list for, you know, 1 or 2 people here and there throughout the study. I think we only had 1 person that was referred to veteran services. The suggestion that we develop rapport before study procedures were commenced. To assess whether we did that well, we looked back, and for those that had completed the 12-month assessment about 4 months ago, 73% of the participants at 12 months remembered their baseline visit as very positive experience. So apparently we did okay at that. 19% said it was somewhat positive, and the remaining 8% were neutral. No one said that their baseline assessment was a negative experience. So that's good. As far as intensity of the intervention delivery, 86% of the sample felt that there were not enough messages sent, even though we doubled the intensity from the previous research study. Only 29% felt that the number of messages were sufficient. So for any future instantiation of the caring context intervention, just keep in mind that folks didn't feel like 1 message a month was really enough for that last 7-month period, or 6-month period. So keep the intensity at 1 to 2, or 2 or more per month would be my suggestion based on this feedback. With regard to recruitment strategies, over half, 60% of the participants recruited were by the recommended means, so through Facebook advertisements, radio announcements. I did a couple of radio interviews for radio stations up in South Dakota, flyers and word of mouth. 40% of our participants said that they heard about the study by word of mouth, which was what the community members told us was going to be the case. That was going to be the most common way that people would hear about it. And turned out, of course, they were right, as the community most often is. Regarding our outcome measures, at baseline, the locally informed methods of attempting suicide or self-harm, driving, cold, walking out to traffic, things like that, on the train tracks, accounted for us capturing an additional 911 suicide attempts across about 130 participants that we would never have detected had we not included those additional means that the community suggested that we include in the SOSI count. So that ended up being a really important adaptation. So in summary, the goal of the adaptation process for the study was to improve the fit of the features of the study to the characteristics of the community where it would take place and the people who would participate. The community consultation process also altered many other study design features, broadened eligibility criteria with regard to age and possession of a cellular device. Outcome measure adaptations allowed us to capture a wider range of suicidal behavior than otherwise would have. This experience, the resulting data, validates the importance of community engagement, and that similar community engagement with the priority population would be beneficial for all intervention research with any and all populations, not just if you're working in Indian country. You can consider it if you're just working in rural America, or if you're working in an urban setting. You should really try and engage this kind of process with the sorts of folks who would eventually end up being eligible to participate in your study. Those are the people that you mean to help in the long run. And so you should get their input on the front end. Okay, so I did purposely leave some time for question and answer period discussion. I think we got probably about an hour, actually. I ran a little faster than I thought I was going to go. What thoughts and questions do we have from the audience?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Nelson. We did have a few questions, and also in the chat, I just want to shout out that a lot of people are resonating with the participation from the community and just, all of the things that you were touching on that aren't always acknowledged. So I just want to shout out that people are really grateful for your perspective. And one question we have. So what language were the interactions conducted in, both oral and written? If it was English, then what steps were taken to mitigate language obstacles? And you kind of touched upon this. But if indigenous languages, which of the 300 or so Alaskan indigenous languages? Thank you.
So we went with the language that the person conducting the interviews was most comfortable with. So Kelly Jansen was a descendant of the Aleut. up in Alaska, and so we used Aleut for her messages. In Cherokee Nation, obviously it was Cherokee. Fort Peck, it was in Sioux. Even though there was Assiniboine also in that community, our study assessor, Albert, was Sioux, and so we used his language. So generally that was the case. Now, among participants, we did ask folks how well they spoke their native language. And I think I have that. Not too difficult to get a hold of. It was not a very large number who said that they spoke it fluently. The most common response was that they spoke a little, and the least common response was that they were fluent. So none of the assessments were conducted solely in the native tongue of the community. They were conducted in English, and all of the participants were proficient in English. So it didn't really come up that we needed translation services for anybody.
Thank you. And someone just put this in the chat. They said, I'm sorry if I missed this. Why use the term quote unquote suicide season? Do you say this around the participants? It seems so deficit based.
Yeah, no, we did not use that language necessarily. That came from one of the key informant interviews with a mental health professional who referred to the springtime as being suicide season because that is the time of year during which there are the most suicides nationally. It was attributed during those conversations to, folks expecting to start to feel better as they come out of the winter. This was particularly referred to in Alaska, and then not actually feeling better, even though spring had arrived, and that was the time of year that the most suicide attempts and deaths by suicide occurred. So while I used that language in the presentation because it was a direct quote from the key informant, we did not use that language in any of the study materials.
Thank you. And the person also said few. Thank you.
Yeah.
And another question I have, I'm not sure if I understand the language completely, but let me know and maybe we can ask for a clarification. But it says, for the later stages of life, was there an attempt made to differentiate elder suicides enacted in a reasoned, intentional, and informed framework versus elderly suicide enactments that were done more from feelings of desperation and loss of hope?
Those were explored in the follow-up interviews in terms of asking folks all follow-up questions sort of surrounding attempts. I have to say that there weren't really that many among the elders who participated. The ideation was more common than attempts were in that age group. Yeah, we didn't have that many cases in that age group to really be able to explore that differentiation. Hope that answers the question.
I know you also touched on this, but someone asked, how did you create or develop those tracks of messages per age group?
Yeah, that was really more dependent on the local customs and came into play mostly in the Pine Ridge site. That was where, at least from the input from the community members and our community assessor, who was actually conducting the interviews, in that community, it was very important that to our assessor that she acknowledge her relative position to the other people in her community that she was interacting with through use of those terms of reference, right? So she felt it was important to use the appropriate terminology, and so that was where that was used most heavily, was at the Pine Ridge site. The other sites didn't it didn't seem quite as relevant to either the community members or the assessor. But we did include it because we definitely did use the appropriate terms and so on for the Pine Ridge site because it was important there.
You. And we have one more question. If anyone else has anything they'd like to ask, please feel free to put it in the Q&A just because we have some time. If you have anything that you want to ask, now's the time. But someone says, so were there preventative measures put in place before the season for interventions to prevent suicides?
Well, each one of the communities had some efforts in place to reduce suicide prior to the study starting up. This was kind of seen as a value-added intervention. But for instance, Cherokee Nation has the Zero Suicide Program, from whom we received a number of referrals. In Cherokee Nation, I think that was actually one of the more common ways that people heard about the study, is that they were picked up during the screening efforts for the Zero Suicide campaign and referred by the behavioral health community prevention team to the study staff because they had screened positive as part of that effort. So, the caring context intervention, again, was really kind of conceptualized both by us as the study team and by our community partners as a value-added intervention. Like how many more suicides might we be able to prevent if we implement this in the community? Is this actually going to be helpful? So yeah, there were existing efforts.
Thank you. And someone also asked, can you please share again how you hired the interviewers or assessors? For example, were they community members, professionals, clinical staff, and what was their background?
So they were typically community health workers. They were not mental health professionals necessarily. Everybody did undergo a pretty intense training schedule and regimen. I personally instructed most of them in an indigenized approach to motivational interviewing, and emphasized person first language and all the sort of good practices, best clinical practices. Everybody that was hired by the study was a member of the community in which they were working. We didn't hire anybody from the outside to go in. And we did, of course, provide training and ongoing supervision to those persons. All of the sessions were recorded and reviewed, and feedback was given where needed to make sure that they were conducting the assessments as we would want them conducted.
Important, as you have all obviously talked about. And we have actually two more questions. Someone asked, I may have missed this. How did you quote unquote quantify or operationalize report or building report? Was it the number of text calls or correspondences?
So the building of rapport was just something that happened at the beginning of each assessment session. And it was really just a period where we encouraged folks who were conducting the assessments to not touch the research tools for the first 10 minutes at least, and just spend some time introducing themselves if they didn't already know the person. Oftentimes they had been passing acquaintances because these were pretty small communities where people, know each other. But the instruction was take 10 minutes, just chat, just get to know each other, get comfortable. And then you can pick up the informed consent document and start to review it with them. But in the beginning, just spend some time getting to know each other and getting comfortable. It wasn't really quantified beyond that, but that was the standard instruction for the assessors.
And then finally, do you have any thoughts on implementing these culturally specific efforts at the schools?
Schools. Well, we didn't recruit kids So we didn't have anybody school aged unless they were an 18-year-old who was about to graduate or something, or maybe a returning adult student who was, going back for their GED or whatever. But we didn't specifically try and implement the intervention through the school system. The South Central Foundation site did want to implement the study intervention in a somewhat more real world sort of manner. And that actually ended up causing some problems with the Alaska Area Institutional Review Board, because they wrote into their protocol, that any responses received from study participants would be responded to within 24 hours of receipt of the text response or email response. And the clinician who was assigned to carry out the intervention failed to respond within the 24-hour period on a few different occasions. And the Alaska Area IRB eventually shut down the study at that site because of that issue. I flew up to Anchorage and tried to make the case that they shouldn't shut it down. We should just be allowed to provide remediation and training to the clinician and counsel them to more promptly respond to any responses received, and they didn't go for it. And that was when we shut the study down at South Central Foundation and added the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe as the 5th community partner.
Yeah, that's tricky. As a follow-up, also wanted to add or ask, what are your next steps, and how will you implement and the protective factors you identified, such as language affirmations, phishing, and powwows?
It's going to be dependent upon the community and the resources that are available in each community. Probably the most well-resourced communities that we included were the South Central Foundation and Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Those both have pretty robust systems of care that I think could pretty easily implement this intervention for folks who screen positive in their community. I think it's going to be more challenging to implement in places like Pine Ridge and Fort Peck, and to some extent Cheyenne River, where the infrastructure just isn't as developed for behavioral health care. Anecdotally, the IHS clinic in Pine Ridge had something like an 80% no-show rate for appointments. Folks would be referred, maybe make an initial appointment, but then 80% of them didn't show and didn't call. And I think that speaks to sort of the level of trust in IHS and Pine Ridge. It's not very high. I know in Fort Peck, they were making some strides to, I know that they had broken ground on a wellness center when I had been there to conduct the focus groups and key informant interviews back in 2016. I don't know how that effort has progressed, but if that system is up and running, I suspect that they also would be able to implement the intervention pretty easily, because there was an integrated behavioral health clinic planned for that center. And because it was not IHS, it was led by the Health Promotion and Disease Prevention department, headed up by Kenny Smoker. It had the feel of being a more trusted institution than the Indian Health Service is. And so I suspect that Kenny probably would be able to implement the intervention through that infrastructure if it successfully got up and running. I'm not sure how COVID affected it, the timeline. So, yeah, long story short, I think it's going to depend on the resources in the community and just, I guess, also possibly the political will within the community. Yeah.
I mean, one quote that stuck with me from earlier in your presentation was that the magic ingredient is social connection. And I like that phrasing a lot. Oh, I think I actually got a question. Yes, thank you. Have you also looked at the White Mountain Apache model or the Native Transformations Project? Lots of good work in Indian country.
Yes, the White Mountain Apache work I'm aware of. We didn't incorporate the model into this study because there was actually a phase pre-1 that took place before the grant went in, where we consulted with the original 4 communities that we planned to partner with and presented them with different intervention approaches that were available and had some support in the research literature. And they specifically selected the caring context intervention across the board as the one that they wanted to try out in their communities, because they felt that it was sort of the most feasible and low barrier, which is why we selected this intervention to evaluate through the randomized clinical trial. But you're right, lots of good work being done in Indian country, especially at White Mountain.
If anyone has any other questions, I don't see any lingering at this moment. No worries. They said I'll quit hogging the questions. Something you can hog away.
Hog away. We got plenty of time, folks. And feel free to ask about anything. I mean, it doesn't even necessarily have to do with the phase 1 work. We did just conclude follow-up assessments for the randomized clinical trial. So we have ended data collection, but we are, because that was only 8 days ago, or no, 5 days ago, we're still in the data cleaning phase. So I don't actually have findings about the differences between the control group and the intervention group, though I would love to come back and share those with folks once we do have those findings.
People came through with a few other questions too. So
great.
One is, if we wanted to start this in our community, how would we start?
So depending on the size of your community and the size of your practice base, you would go about it differently. If you had a relatively small community with a relatively limited practice base, you could simply get a clinic phone and start, by using the PHQ-9 to screen for depressive symptoms. And anybody who, hits the 2 cardinal symptoms goes on the list, and you just start sending them caring messages manually. That's if it's manageable in terms of the size of the population that you're serving. If it isn't, there are a number of platforms available that will send automated messages that are pre-programmed, that you compose. So the content of the message is determined by you. The timing of the messages is determined by you. But once you put in all the parameters for the messaging course, you just add a phone number and a start date, and that system will automatically send those messages on that schedule to that number. I think the least expensive version that looked operable the last time that I checked was a couple months ago. Somebody asked me a similar question. I think there was one that was available for something like 400 messages per month for like $30 a month or something like that. So not terribly expensive and potentially able to send out a relatively large number of messages per month for a relatively reasonable price. Um, and so those are pretty feasible platforms for carrying out this kind of intervention in communities of various size.
And I think you mentioned that you were still kind of cleaning up data, but someone asked what the timeline for the rest of the study is.
So we are in data cleaning and analysis for the next month, and then we're in dissemination and manuscript generation through March of 2024.
I'm not sure if someone asked if there's any information about how people feel about this in a year or so, like, over time. Are you looking at anything like that?
Yeah, we did conduct qualitative interviews with folks at 18 months. It was just a subset. I think we collected like 50 or so of those qualitative interviews. And those data are currently being coded. As you can imagine, since we just finished up data collection, the number of people who had hit the 18-month mark was not, hadn't ended until last week. So, because they were randomly selected to participate in the qualitative interviews or have those offered to them. We don't have all of those data coded and analyzed yet. But some anecdotal quotes that I've seen pulled from those interviews. One of them is actually the title of a manuscript that we submitted for publication about the adaptations and how they improved the fit of the study to the communities. Keep the messages coming. Sometimes they were a lifesaver. Is a direct quote from one of the participants, and it is now the title of a manuscript that went into it was the Journal of Psychiatric Nursing, I want to say.
Yeah, that's a powerful one.
Yeah, we thought so too.
We have another question. People are really keeping them coming. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Did your research staff run into any challenges with knowing folks who were referred to the study, given the relatively small size of these communities? If so, how are these addressed? Some of our folks are hesitant to engage with behavioral health staff due to concerns about who would know they were accessing services.
Yeah, that did come up. And because research participation is confidential, we were able to assure folks that word of their participation was not going to get around. And part of that had to do with the selection of the field staff. Selecting people who had some degree of clinical acumen and understood confidentiality and could be trusted, frankly, to keep their trap shut. And so reassurances regarding confidentiality during the informed consent process was the most common way of addressing that. We did have a couple of instances where a research participant acted inappropriately with our field staff. And in that particular case, we were able to assign that person to a different field staff member from the same community for future interactions, just because there had previously been bad blood between that research participant and the person who was originally in contact with them as research staff from that community. We did try to have 2 folks at each site at minimum, just in case issues like that came up. And indeed they did. And so typically it was the assurance of confidentiality during the informed consent process and or assignment to the field staff member with the least relationship to the person.
Thank you. Don't see any more questions at this exact moment. I guess give it a sec, see if anyone has anything
Sure.
pop up.
This is actually my favorite part of giving presentations in this format is the question and answer period. So if you have anything on your mind, please, by all means, ask about it.
wait a sec, but if not, we can always give you part of your day back. No sweat. And Lonnie, you're pretty open about having your your email if people need to contact you. So we can also put that in the chat.
Yes, there you have it. It's up on the screen now. It's just my first name dot my last name at wsu.edu.
Now I know because I've been emailing your wrong email.
Yeah. And everybody who's stuck around this long, all 112 of you, get to learn a word in Cherokee. It's "Aton." Aton. It means thank you. I really appreciate your attention and taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to me ramble on about our work.
Thank you so much, everyone. Great presentation. Thank you, Lonnie.
Thanks.